Department of Public Works, Bureau of Water and Wastewater.
Oh, okay, thank you. Parijat, you still with us? Oh,
Hi, I am with Kansas City Water. I am organizational development practitioner here.
yeah, and Ramona?
Hi, I'm Ramona Harry. I am from Baltimore City Department of Public Works, and I'm an operations officer.
And Catherine?
Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine Curtis. I am the Workforce Reliability Manager at San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and I'm also the BayWork President. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, Catherine.
Okay, so I appreciate everybody's participation. Did I miss anybody? Because, okay. So, Kesra, should we, or Parijat, should we go into the spreadsheet and just start looking at where we're at with it? Or does anybody need any introduction to what we're trying to do today? Okay, so either Kesra, do you want to maybe share the spreadsheet?
Mm-hmm. I reviewed some of the comments. Oops, sorry, got the wrong one.
It's okay.
Sometimes you click too fast and it just goes to the wrong screen. There we go.
I have to make myself slow down when I'm doing it, Kesra. Because I know I'm going to hit the wrong one. I've done it so much. I'm like, nope, just wait. Give it 3 seconds.
Yeah, it's almost like all you need is the 2 seconds, and yet, you know. So I think a couple of things. I was going through some of the comments in here. They're really, really good comments. Some, you know, things we may want to bring to this team that at least that in my mind, I want to sort of question before we move forward so we're all on the same page. But I think what we want to do is also look at the next steps, right? Now that we've got this great comments, how do we parse it out so that people can look at these good comments? Because obviously we can't look at each one today in these meetings and kind of say, okay, do these new comments make sense? Do we agree with it and then eliminate what we were doing before and replace it? Or how do we move forward? So I think those are the 3 things. One of the questions I had as I was looking at this is, Alice, you made some really good comments, and one of the comments that I was looking at, for example, and I think this will be good for all of us as we move forward to understand. So some of the questions you say, why are you asking this question? For example, so there's a question here that says, my organization has a communication department for managing and distributing internal information. And then your comment is, well, why are we even asking this, right? They should know. But if we're doing a maturity model and if an organization doesn't have it, then that kind of goes against the scale, right? Whereas if they do, then it does. So I guess I wanted your thoughts on why would you think that we don't need that question? So that'll help
I guess
understand how we've developed the framework. I mean, the question.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that's kind of why I brought those questions up there, because there are some things that it almost seems like we'd have information just for managers. Like, you really should have a communications department. You really should have I forget the first one that had to do with training, like a set training program. But it seemed like most of the questions in here were things that we put out in an employee survey. And so it seems like there were sort of 2 buckets of questions. Some of them were like recommendations to management, like you need to kind of start here and have these programs in place. And there was a second set, which was the majority of them, that were things that you would put out in a survey to employees to find out how their experience with the organization was. Like if they were feeling supported and if they were feeling like encouraged, but you wouldn't ask the employees, like, do you have a communications department? Because, it's kind of silly to ask that, because it's like yes or no. And it's a fact as opposed to like finding out people's experiences. And so I was trying to just parse out, like, maybe we need two separate things. One that just goes to managers with suggestions, and another one that is the questionnaire you send to employees.
And that's what I kind of figured when I was looking at some of your responses, that's where you were getting at. And that's where I think that we need to have that discussion today to really say, there are some questions at an organizational level. It's like, well, if you don't have this, then at a level 5 maturity level, you're short. But then are the employees, comfortable with the kind of communication coming out of that? That's a whole different, bar. So I guess that's something we need to kind of discuss. How do we want to manage that? Because that'll drive how we review these new suggestions, right? So I'm open to
well, yeah, it could be that also that this is, it says, do you have a communications department, which is not all organizations are going to necessarily, is having a communications department as opposed to a way of communicating, is a question too. If you're a smaller organization, you may not have a communications department, but you may be very effective in communicating with each other.
Ramona, your hand is up.
Yes. My thought was that at least having those can help to inform the organizations that these are things that will inform their maturity level. Yeah. So it's almost as saying, well, do you have this part of your organization established? For instance, training. I think it helps the management or executive staff in organizations to say, okay, these are things we need to be thinking about, because we may be small and we don't need a full-on communications department, but we at least need to establish how we communicate.
And are you also saying, Ramona, I mean, maybe that you need a communications function,
Yes.
something like that. Yeah.
I think we could maybe change that to say, do you have a formal process for communication? So that could be a department, that could be.
Yeah.
That's great. I see that Sherry has her hand up, and then Catherine.
Yes, I was just going to ask, and I think that it was answered when, instead of saying you should have, but do you have a way of effectively or formally communicating? Because what if an organization doesn't have the budget to have these different departments? I mean, just even speaking with some organizations nearby to us, they would love to have a training department or a training division, and they just don't have it in their budget. So if they don't have a budget, are we also going to help them come up with a solution? Maybe collaborating with other utilities, or, what, are we going to do that? Or this is just some food for thought for them to kind of ponder?
That's a really great question. And I think that my thought is that, and I would really appreciate if, Patricia Butler and others who are really professionals in this area. I'm an engineer, so, you understand what my limitations are. But the idea was that the survey would sort of check the temperature, check the vital signs to see like what areas where there may be vulnerabilities and things like that, and then that there would be some sort of a improvement methodology that would include such questions. And I want to let Catherine speak, but I also don't want to not answer the question from Sherry, because it's very important and sort of made me think. Does anybody have thoughts on Sherry's question before we go to Catherine? Catherine?
Well, actually, Sherry, you're so good. That's exactly what I was going to say. Are you considering how many full-time employees each of these agencies have? And if you don't know, maybe that should be a question on the survey so you can calculate their answers a little better, and perhaps ask about collaboration with utilities near them for shared training needs or shared needs for candidate development. Being the president of Bayworks, some of my utilities have as few as 5 employees, and then we go up to 2,500. So there's a whole spread there. And what utilities can do oftentimes is based on how many employees they have, and what their budgets are. So Sherry, you were right on target.
You know, Kesra,
like
there
that.
was, you might mention, you know, that there is a kind of a demographics portion at the front end that does have that kind of information, and also categorizes the responder in terms of what, you know, what their role in the organization is and so forth.
So yeah, we can kind of get to that tab at the end. So some of the demographics, but I do want to step back just a second. And I think the first question we need to address is, should this question even be asked, right? Because that's what Alice is asking. Management should know this, don't need to ask employees. So that's where I think our first thing is, before we even determine what kind of question, do you have a formal process or do you have a department, but is this question needed? And to a certain extent, yes, if we say it is needed, and to Alice's point, you know, is it really to the employees that you're asking, or is this to the management? Because as an organization, we should have it on our radar. If we don't have this, maybe we should consider it. But from an employee perspective, it's really the messaging and communication that's received is more important than whether they have the formal process or not. So I think that's our first question, is if we have these two questions, so do we have sort of maybe each question we say this should be for the organization as a whole? Again, we come back to that organizational culture versus the workforce, right? That whole debate that we keep having, whether, you know, we combine it or we separate it, or maybe we, you know, how do we, you know, how do we handle that? I guess that's where, before we even dig into whether that question is correctly, you know, posed, it's whether
Parjat has her hand up.
Yeah. I was just saying, let's say if the question is, my organization has communication, the answer, if the answer is no, it is not going to make us come up with a new department. Like we said, I mean, you know, you are not going to just based on that feedback start a new division. It is more about whatever that work that department is, you know, trying to achieve, is that somehow getting achieved or not. More about the formal process, like you said, Kesra.
And then, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Parijat, apologize. Go ahead.
No, just one more. And then we can have questions more in terms of hierarchy. If somebody says yes to this, then we have these questions come up. If no, then rest of the questions don't even show up.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Patricia has her hand up too.
Yeah.
I think what Parjat said is excellent, because you are going to have people, organizations of different sizes, and really what you want to know is the concept. How well are they communicating in this particular instance? And they have whatever that infrastructure is. If they have 25 employees, then it might be they have team meetings every day and they're doing that, and they don't have a communications process. It's the operations manager that's doing it. So it's really not about so much their organization structure as it is about, are they being effective in what they're doing? So if I'm looking at the difference between a level 1 and a level 5, I'm trying to assess how well they're communicating. And if communication is not getting out to the team members, then, or to the employees, then to me, you're at a level, you know, you're at that 0, you're not there yet. So we really want to think about, in light of, if we have questions that specifically say, you know, do you have a department you know, we may want to change those to what I think Kezra's example was, or someone gave the example, to change that. So it's not about the functional department, but it's about the concept of, are you actually doing it and are you effective in doing it?
Yeah, this is Scott. I'm going to pretend that I'm Mark Poling for a minute because he's not on the call. And I think what he would probably say is that we don't want two surveys, you know, one for this group of employees and this one for managers and stuff. But is there a way to incorporate, you know, basically have one? But I'd also say that, you know, case where somebody said, if you just change this to say, my organization has a process for managing and distributing internal information, rather than mention the, you know, the organization. That's one way out of it. And then the other issue was who answers the question that Alice was raising. And you could say in the questionnaire itself, you know, for manager response only or something like that, so that it's still part of an overall survey. It's just the employee knows that they wouldn't have to, you know, to answer. Although if you change it, does the organization have a formal process? It would be interesting to see what employees thought about that.
Well, yeah, you know, so that's a really good point, Scott, because I was just thinking about that. So if we pose the question, rather than say, do you have a department, which is whether it is whether you have it or not, it's there, it's open. But if you just talk about a formal process, well, management might think, yeah, we have a formal process. We got Joe Blow over there that sends out all the emails. And then if you ask the employees, they're going to say, we don't have a formal process. We just get emails randomly here and there, right? So there may be that flip side of the same question where employees' perception of what they're receiving may be very different from what the management thinks that they're doing.
Yeah, Ramona, have hand up.
That was exactly my point I was going to make, because a lot of times organizationally we're set up where we say, oh, we have this and it's on the chart and it works for what's on paper, but the employees and the boots on the ground, they have no idea what that means. They look at it and they think, okay, half the time I don't know what's going on. I don't know what direction we're going in. I don't know when it changes. I usually hear it through the grapevine. I don't get anything formal. And for our organization, we have a lot of folks that are working in the field that don't get emails. So I think it's a good question to ask employees, and you get a bit of a gauge of what their perception of the organization is compared to what management's perception of the organization. And sometimes they're so far apart, it gives you a good window into where you may need to make adjustments and changes in the workforce, in the culture. It just gives you a really good gauge of that.
Sherry had her hand up as well.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what Ramona was just saying, because I was definitely agreeing with everything. This is also, it also encourages accountability, because we're not necessarily saying that the organization doesn't have it, but my question would be, how well is the process being followed? And so, like what Ramona was saying about the people that work in the field, they don't always have access to the technology to receive the information. However, I know, for instance, well, in larger organizations where maybe the leadership is given the information to send to their teams, though that's not always happening. And so, you know, this is also making it accountable, because if it's not happening, then the people who work in the field or in any other capacity may not even know that there is something formalized. And so this is kind of putting a spotlight on it and making the people that should be sharing the information more accountable to say, oh, right, we are supposed to, it's highlighted here, let me do the right thing.
So just to, would you say then, what you're talking about is it effective? And I think Alice was kind of saying that. So you could change the question to say that, you know, that the organization has a formal process and effectively distributes and, you know, that, and, you know, and communicates, you know, you could you could combine it or split it and have 2 questions.
And, and that would be a very interesting response to have from both the management and the employees, because the management might say, yes, it's effective, but the employees may say not. And so then that's a whole nother conversation, getting those types of results.
Yeah. Ramona had her hand up.
I'm sorry, I should have taken it down.
Catherine?
Catherine Curtis then.
Yeah.
I just want to say perception is reality. I agree with everything that Sherry said. And oftentimes there's a very wide divide between employees and management, especially if the employee morale is low. And it's been my experience that oftentimes management is all engaged in like a strategic business plan or planning efforts that they're very proud of, but it doesn't reach down into the organization. It's the same 15 people on top that are doing all of this, and it's not oftentimes communicated well to the people in the field. And so perception is reality. I think getting both sides of the equation when asking the questions is going to bear a lot of fruit for your outcomes.
Kasra, how are we doing? I mean, we have another half hour basically. What else do you want to get accomplished?
So the other thing I was, before we move to the next steps, I think that's where I'd like to kind of have some feedback on the new comments that are added. How do we tackle those? Should we, a couple of us, kind of go in and look at them and come up with our thing, or can we again divide it with different people taking different tabs for a week? So start thinking about that. But I do want to get to the demographic questions. I did just a little bit of work on this, Scott, based on what you had put up here. I think you had put that up there. I wasn't sure if you had, or Cello, some demographic questions.
I can't remember where this comes from.
Yeah, me either, frankly.
I think it's Parijat may have added this.
Someone put these up, so I basically laid them out this way so it's easier to see. So I would like to suggest, if everyone can look at them, some of the questions are: what unit of work do you represent? Years of service. Describing the environment that you typically work in. So, and then what best describes your role? And then there was a question about age group. Do we want to know what demographics are responding how, right? So some of the things I thought in this that I questioned, the one in red, well, I questioned the ones in red for age groups, because I don't know if we need to even ask that, but it's a good indication of how the young people coming on board feel about certain things versus people that have been, working all their lives and they really don't care, right? Or that they have a whole different mindset. So, but whether that age group, whether we should include it, and if so, if that age groups make sense. This is a little tricky too, because I kind of looked at what whoever had up here and try to lay it out. And so some of my things is, okay, so you could be a frontline staff, but also be a team lead. So I added a team lead, supervisor level, a manager director level, which is sort of like your middle management, and then an executive level. And of course we have the frontline staff, but then we have that non-supervisory office personnel, right? Someone like me that works in the office, but nobody reports to me, right? So I don't know if those are a good breakdown. Do we want to break them down further, or do we want to collapse them? But again, all of these questions kind of need a review and opinion. I think, Alice, you have your hand up.
Yeah, every organization is going to have their own terms and own breakdown. And so I don't feel like we really even can put together a list that's going to work for everybody. so this is one of those things, if people are worried more about sort of equity, they're going to want to ask more racial identity questions.
Right.
But others aren't, and because then that might come down to knowing this answer is from this particular person. So yeah, I mean, some of the things like, age, service with the industry, you can put out there to any organization, but like some of these other ones our executive is called the director.
Right.
So like that question wouldn't make sense in my particular organization, but it would in yours. So I don't know if there's just a way we can put like things in parentheses and says like tailor this to your organization, but you want to ask about frontline staff, supervisory, and executive level, and just kind of leave it a lot more broad with like what you're trying to say rather than specific.
I had thought that these would be sort of, we provide them as samples, right? So to say, here are the different demographic questions you may ask, and here are some samples of what you could ask, and the organizations would change them or add and do whatever based on their organization. I don't know how Cello has his hand up.
Yeah, I'll yield to Pat, and then I'll raise my question.
Okay, I was just going to comment on age group. I don't necessarily like age group as a question, but perhaps you can ask what generation they may identify with. Food for thought.
Yeah. I had a couple of things, and then Sherry has her hand up, and I believe you guys are professionals. You'll be far better at doing this. From what I've observed is it's so important that these things are anonymous, because especially in smaller organizations, demographics questions could really point the finger and say who it is. It would people may feel exposed. So those places where there's fear, where there's and the biggest discrepancy between management and staff, and that are where the staff is most vulnerable, would probably not give adequate results. So I would look to some suggestions and ideas on how we can avoid that. The second thing is maybe to see how many questions is it reasonable for our survey to have, because right now we have a lot of them and we're trying to cover a lot of ground, but to get to some sense of overall, do we want to have, because like on the employee engagement Gallup, they have 12 questions, and here we have like a lot of questions. So maybe what is the reasonable number of questions? And the third comment would be if, for example, somebody in this group, which I'm so delighted that you guys are participating, has an idea on, let's say specifically the demographic questions. If somebody could look at that and say, okay, this is, and help us with that, that'd be really great. Anyway, those are just the thoughts that I had, and I see that Alice has her hand up. Oops, the hand.
Sorry, just forgot to take it down.
Oh, okay.
So I just put my hand up. This is Scott. I mean, one possibility, just to get the point across, is that these are kind of examples. So what work group do you represent? For example, or I mean, you could put in parentheses, for example, and then list whatever, people are decided on. I think getting the feedback that Chella was talking about, like if you put down age group, then why wouldn't you put gender? Why wouldn't you put racial identity or, other things? And you're right, it's going to vary from group to group. Maybe you don't need it. These were just possibilities, but, which I think is the point. The other thing to say is that we have a core group, and Khosrow, you were asking, about, well, we should talk about this at least, but we are going to be running these things by both the workforce group as well as the organizational culture group. And if we, facilitate this properly, then we could get feedback about what they like, what they think the priorities are, what they don't, what their questions are, those kind of things. When we get feedback, and I don't know, I'm just going to throw this into Cello. There's basically another iteration of the use of Mural, which allows you to do some report backs, that are going to be that specific and don't take that much time. And we've seen that on one of the improvement teams where Richard Windsor has kind of facilitated that kind of process, and it's fast and efficient, and you get a lot of feedback, more than using the comments column. So anyway, that I'll stop there. But maybe Khosra, I mean, whether it's you and Alice or what it is, just taking all these comments in red and putting a holistic lens to it, and Parjat, and basically coming up with a new straw man, so to speak, for the questions and the statements, and then we kind of go from there, because we can. And if you did that, and then we met, let's say next week, we also have to brief the leads on what's happened, and so that we can set up the workshop properly. That's going to happen supposedly not next week, but the week after. So I'll stop.
Patricia Butler, you have your hand up.
You're on mute.
I think I have a question, and this is when we're looking at the demographic questions. And just if you can bring me back to the purpose of sending out this survey. What is really the purpose? Because I think that's going to determine what demographic questions that we want to ask, if we want to ask any at all.
Okay, the purpose of the survey is that it would be, what we wanted to start with was a maturity model that sort of shows the range of to identify the important things, and we identified those. I think we call them categories, which is like trust and engagement and communications and all that, and reward and recognition, and then to establish a range from like terrible to wonderful, and so these questions would then be an assessment tool to help people understand where they are roughly on that range, and identify. So it wouldn't really provide any solutions, but it would be more like a diagnostic assessment tool of your as-is conditions. And then one would look at those results of the assessment. They say, you know what, we have a problem. People are happy with the number of emails they're getting from us, but they hate what we're saying, or something like that. You know what I mean? Or they just like you and Sherry, I think, I can't remember who said, there's this discrepancy of what management thinks and what staff. So for example, those kinds of things that would show where they need to make improvements.
So
does that make sense, Patricia?
It does. So based on that, then to me, the only real demographic thing that really is important is if they're a manager or if they're a frontline worker or a non-manager, maybe. I love data that deals with age groups, but I don't think it's necessary for the purpose of this survey that we're going to send out, so they can evaluate the maturity model. But what we do know, what would be important, is to know whether they're frontline staff or whether they're supervisory or general admin. Maybe it's just 2 or 3 things that we ask. And the only 2 that I think that might be needed would be number 4 and possibly number 1, but maybe paring it down to operations, maintenance, and administrative support. Maybe those would be the 3 categories. Operations, maintenance, admin support, if we needed that. But I think knowing whether they're frontline or whether they're manager, I think is going to be important. So that way they can say the managers answered it this way, but the frontliners say this way. So we have a gap between how people how we think we're doing and how we're actually doing. That might be, you know, if we're going to send it out to multiple people and expect multiple people in the organization to respond to the survey. So I think that would be the better criteria. I don't think the number of years of service and their age would support this particular study. Although, like I said, I'm a fan. I love knowing what younger folks coming in look at versus those that are getting ready to retire. It's great information, but I don't think it's, I think if we keep it simple, and to your point, Chella, earlier, the less, the more anonymous it is, if they can protect their anonymity, then they're going to respond.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Patricia. That's very insightful, and it would help us also tighten it up. So, Sherry?
Yes, I wanted to talk about the age section as well. I think that it's very valuable for this project because it helps with generational diversity awareness. So if we are receiving a lot of responses regarding maybe trust, or if we receive a lot of responses around recognition, if we understand which generation the participants are coming from, you know, that will give the organization a heads up of maybe they need to change how they are doing things. I always include generational diversity training when I am bringing in new interns or apprentices, because there's 5 generations in the workforce, and this is the first time in our history that it's ever been. And when you can understand how to motivate, how to encourage, how to work with side by side or with these different generations, it really helps make the organization run that much more smoother. It gives people, you know, more comfort, and it also helps with trust, because you know that you know how you need to be communicated with or worked with, and you understand, if you're working on a team, how the people on your team, because of their experiences regarding their generation, how they need to also be involved and treated.
Okay, Scott, you had your hand up, or is it?
Yeah, I was just gonna, again, what I think Mark has said from the very beginning is that on which best describes your role, that regardless of what the descriptor is, you're dealing with basically top leadership, you're dealing with supervisors and leads, and you're talking about other staff, you know, employees, is kind of where he came down. You could put different names on it, but that would allow you to distinguish largely. And then, you know, I think the thought on what work unit do you represent is, let's just say you got terrible results in operations or in information technology. If you're doing this organization wide, then it would be useful to know that the gaps are bigger, you know, in certain parts of the organization. But, you know, whether that's essential or not, you know, people can decide. But, you know, and I kind of side with Patricia on the age group. We can always say, you know, any of this is optional, you know,
Right.
you know, that people don't have to use it, and they can tailor it, you know, to meet their needs. Kesra.
Yeah, so I actually, that's the point I was going to make, was if we, you know, part of the assessment, if we have these demographic questions that organization may or may not ask with some examples, that's all we need to give them. Then each organization can determine, you know, which questions and they want to ask. So they don't have to ask all 5, they could just ask 2. And then they've got we're providing just samples, and they could say, you know, we don't really have a huge HR department, or we don't have a huge IT department. We just want to limit it to maintenance or operations staff and to, you know, office staff, or however. They could tailor it to their needs or to what they're trying. I mean, to me, if as an organization, if I'm going to have a survey, I have a goal in mind. There's something I want to get back. And what is that something? And a lot of these questions will determine who and how will be based on what they're trying to determine. And we could have that verbiage to say, hey, set your goal. What are you trying to get out of this survey? And based on that, you'll select the questions you want to ask, and you'll select the demographics you want to send the survey out to.
Hello.
Yeah, I think I'm coming back to the question that was critically important that Patricia asked, and that is, what is the purpose of the survey?
Mm-hmm.
And if, for example, the comment, and it's also Catherine said, well, we should ask how many employees, which is also a great question. And how many employees is a critical question if we're going to if we want to have consistency in the survey and be able to do any kind of comparison between different utilities on benchmarking. But it's not necessary if it's a survey that just is for that one organization, because they know how many people are there. So it is, fascinating conversation. And if there's always a balance, the more, obviously, the more we can find out about some of these things, the age group and all the differences. A statistician, or how long you've been with the company, a statistician in ourselves say, oh yeah, that'd be so great. But what are the impacts of that in terms of anonymity and stuff like this? It's a really delicate balance. So the one thing that I would propose is fundamental is that the question 4, however it's framed, is really, like Patricia said, it is really essential, because the perspectives, the differences in perspectives. So since we have only about 10 minutes left, it'd be great if in the next few minutes we can talk about how do we cull this down? How do we synthesize? How do we move forward so that we don't end up with, a survey that's like, 200 questions, or that, how can we engage this great talent we have on this call to help us prune this? And then what Scott said is, when we go to the other folks, I think it'll be, the more we can refine this approach, the easier we will be for the other folks who haven't been looking at all this sausage making to give us their opinion. Because one thing we don't want is to go back and collect another 400 comments,
Alice had her hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, a lot of the conversation we've been having right now is exactly what is always needs to come into a conversation about a survey. And anybody who's taken a class on survey design, talks about these very things about, what information do you actually need to get in terms of demographics. And so it just seems like really what we need is context. We don't necessarily need to provide people with demographic questions. We need a paragraph at the top that says, these are the things you need to think about, and think about putting in demographic questions that are going to be most useful for you interpreting the data for your purposes that you have. And, any kind of survey design textbook is going to have that discussion included in it. Yeah. But getting to Cello's point that he was just making, I agree. This is very long. And again, there's going to, it almost seems like that's in the front piece, that in the context part is, think about where you believe you're having the most problems right now, and only take those chunk of questions that are going to be useful to you. Because again, I think it's going to be so specific on what the organization's experiencing, that if we all decide like, okay, you only need these 10 questions, maybe that's true for our organizations, but not for another one. But instead, what we do is we split them into buckets and say, if this is what you want to know, use these questions. If this is what you want to know, use these questions. We still probably have too many in the spreadsheet, but that's how in my mind, it could be useful for the greatest number of people.
Just before we move on to how are we going to take the sausage making machine and actually produce a sausage, I have one question that just came to my mind, Cello, based on what you said. So there's two things here. One, are we preparing this maturity model for organizations to use within their organizations to determine where they're at, or are we also trying to say we are going to go out as UAIM and ask people to do the survey so we can determine and compare the utilities? Because when you mentioned that, that kind of triggered something else in my mind, is if we're trying to assess, if we want an assessment of where all the utilities are so we can compare, then the questions have to be very specific, and we need the same questions and the same demographics that we want the utilities to provide us. But if we're preparing these that organizations can use in their organizations, then it's a different ballgame. Then we do what Ellis just suggested, to say, hey, here are 7 categories. Here are all the questions in these categories that will give you this. If your goal is this, ask these are the questions, and they can pick and choose because they're telling the results within their organization. So I guess that's where I've kind of lost the link now. Are we trying to do this where we compare organizations? Are we doing this for the organizations to figure out where they need to be?
I think that it's, I shouldn't say I think. The way we have originally envisioned this is that this set of questions, this survey, would be actually used by the people who are participating in UAIM, or in future it'll be called WISE. And so it would be possible to have some degree of differences between how they applied. However, if the people, and I'm really delighted to see that network is happening as we speak, but if the network of people engaged in UAIM decide to say, let's look at each other's things, then it would be far easier for them to do that if there was some consistency in the questions and the methodology. My suspicion is also that this kind of, I have not been able to uncover a maturity model, which is a set of parameters that tell you, what you should be looking at for the water sector utilities yet. So that in itself, even maturity model, would provide some guidance. And if we have this, assessment methodology, it's another brick in building, a success. So I didn't envision that this would be sent to 200 utilities and then do analysis. But the consistency in the assessment and the methodology, I think, would have some merit and benefit for peer-to-peer, collaboration and comparison and stuff like that.
Khosrow?
Oh, sorry, I had my hand up from before.
So you posed the question, is it this or is it that? And I would argue that it's at least related to an organization wanting to improve itself, and that because why are they going to do it just to compare with other organizations? They're going to want to focus it on improvements within their organization. Where are the gaps? Do the assessment. Where am I a 1 and a 2? And what am I going to do about it? And what am I going to change? So you at least want to do that. It's kind of a question: is this a reasonable survey that people want to sign up to do, to add on the other objective as well? Is it just another opinion here?
So we only have 4 minutes left. We should figure out what we need to do, the next steps.
Yeah. So would it be possible to get some feedback with each person? Do you what do you think? I would be interested to know, is there some sort of a sense for you how many questions should be in this survey, number one, so that we have some sense of scale? And also, I may be wrong, but it seems to me that what I was hearing from people is saying, I think it was Catherine that says, perception is reality. If the staff tells us that they don't get communications, do we really care if they have a communications department? If the staff says, you know, it seems to me like that might be really the fundamental, you know, measurement for this.
And
Catherine
just
saying 12, sorry.
In the interest of time, if everyone can just put in your answer in the chat window, how many questions? We might just average it out. And then I guess the next steps, maybe Cello, if Parijat, you, maybe Scott and Alice, we can maybe meet and see how we want to attack all the comments and questions that are in red, and then bring anything that we feel need more discussion, then we can bring that back even via email to the teams, or we could schedule a meeting next week to discuss just those. And then this will help us pare them down as well, right?
Yeah, because from what I'm hearing right now from the professionals here is it's 12 to 15 questions, and we have probably 100 right now. So we have a little bit of work cut out for ourselves or have a mechanism to prune this. So I'm wondering what would be the best mechanism to do that, to prioritize, you know, to rate these questions.
So I think that if we, for example, if we got together and we looked at everything in red, and that may help us reduce a number of questions.
Okay.
And they might also combine some of these together. So right here, we've got 3 questions. Do we need all 3? Can we get rid of 2 and only have 1? And then if we, you know, so I think if we go through that exercise, going through these comments, you know, because now we're actually really focused. Before we had 400, then we had, you know, so many categories, 45. Now it's really focused. So this will help us, based on these comments, to reduce them even further. And if we've got 7 categories right now, and if we have 2 questions per category, on average, some might require more than 1, more than 2, and some might require only 1, you know, we could end up with 14 questions, right?
Okay.
Just in the ballpark with what everybody's saying.
I just want to throw this out, and I did put it in the chat, but I don't know if there's an option to take each category and do a separate survey, short survey, 10 questions or less, or 8 questions. And if they know, hey, every week you're going to get a new survey, or every 2 weeks you're going to get a new survey, and it's going to be short. It's only going to take you 5 minutes to do it. And we just split them. Then I think people may get tired of them, or they may say, oh, this is only going to take 5 minutes. I can do it. So that's just a suggestion. And as long as if we don't have a budget for any type of incentive for drawing, because some people will do a longer survey if they can be in a drawing for, you know, an Amazon gift card or something. But outside of that, maybe a series of short ones might be the way to go.
Okay. Okay, so Scott, when is the next workforce meeting?
It's a week from Monday.
It's a week from Monday. So we have 1 week to really consolidate this based on the feedback that we're getting today, which is, you know, keep it short.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, personally, I could go along with whatever the group